можно есть на самом деле. Перхап, возможно. Да, наверное, да. Такие замечания. Ну как тогда делать? Жить-то как? В ком есть музыка? Ну да, да. Ну наоборот, ну ничего, как-нибудь. Я в принципе не против, если меня замечать был, да. Да, да. По-живому, наверное, по-живому. Это обоюдно как-то, да. Все равно так и получается, это обоюдно. Там у тебя свой слушатель, свой актер, да. Ну да. Так нет, так нет. Нелепо, нет сенс. Нет, нет сенс, да, да, да. Да, еще напиши, еще куда-нибудь, да. Дурак ты полный, да. Подлый ты вообще, да. Подлый труп, ты подлый, да. Верно. Жить охота говорит, да. Запиши. Вот нет. Да. Это другая технология, если я вот пока довольно пытаться говорить, да. Я не знаю, как это. Получается, что так, вот оказывается как. Вот, понимаешь, вот и все, это мужчина, это мужская лошадь, все. Это женское восприятие действительности. Это из его ума, что жестоко. Да, понимаю. Вот насыпывает нереально. Конечно, это бывает. Ну, короче, да. Это не жестокость, я тебе говорю, это такое, это просто говорит, пока ты не понимаешь, что. А как вот, я все время забываю, что вы мне как бы, не то что не другие, да, ты как скажешь. Добра не желаете, что ли? Что вам было бы легче, может, чтобы меня вообще не было. Кстати, это даже группа, конечно, ходила. Да. Честно, да. Ну да, и как он это понимает, вот как бы наглый, да. Наверное, нервничать это нужно, как сказать, чем-то. Да. Взаимосвязи, да. Нет, да. Нагретое место в их жизни, понимаете. Да. Вот это тоже, так ведь и говорят, тоже психиатры и все. Человек ушел, да, и ты тут его начинаешь плакать, я понял, да. Да. Ну, понимаешь, да. То есть, да. Ну да, ну это слишком. Наоборот, только. Ой, не вижу. Ну, это все успеть. Ну, к примеру, все, ушел человек, нету его уже, все. Видишь, всего лишь точек его вот. Господь, там, надоели уже с своими. Это все страшные слова, понимаешь, страшная очень инфекция, очень ужасная. Ты знаешь, грыжа, да, понимаешь. Да. Ну, смотрите сами, я просто предупреждаю, что как бы, да, это давно уже умерло, не знаю. Но все равно надо по-настоящему, ты обязан по-настоящему, потому что это все уже старое, старье, это уже все. Да.
Вот кто-то стечет на дно, и потом он должен подняться оттуда, понимаешь? Потому что время идет, да. Да. И там тебе то же самое скажут. А у них, да, понимаешь. Да. Да. Ну ладно, да. Да, вот это есть такое. Да. Вот это, вот как оно, да. Вот так. Вот всего лишь страшно стало тебе, нет? Да. Да, удобно, да, защита агрессия, да. Все нормально, да. Вот, ну ходи неменяемый, да. Да, укроешься меня, да, понял, я да. Ну тогда спасайся там за пазуху куда-нибудь и иди да. Я вас в принципе понимаю, но и не одобряю вас. То есть это не тот вариант. Ему оправдания нету. Время идет вперед, нарабатывай, будь мужиком, тренируйся там, не знаю, фальшиво, настоящий там, как угодно. Шевелись, да. Да, понимаешь, стучать из школы, ну да. Это не по-мужски просто. Ну, это не пафос, я просто, ты понимаешь, не по-мужски. Да. Можно и так, как это тоже сделать, да, он понял. Нормально. Да. Вот тут надо. Свежесть, считанная. Да. Да. Я не знаю, да. Я думаю, что это женская тема сохранения, да. Ну, я понял, он же мне, да. Он хорошо играет просто, да. Ну, мама, женщина, знаешь. Ее мамой надо делать, чтобы она не мужиком была, нормально. Ну, красивый, приличный, и так далее. И добрый даже. И как бы развивалась, но только по-своему. То есть как бы деградировала, да. Вечно с малышами. Как ты будешь развиваться, если они все дегенераты, как да, понимаешь? Это вредно, я тебе просто сразу говорю. Нельзя женщине, да, как угодно, бог хочешь, мог, можешь что угодно говорить. Женщине нельзя развиваться. По природе это запрещено, понимаешь, это законом. Только сталинская мысль тебя понимает, да. Не говори потом, что у тебя не жалуйся, понимаешь. Да как оно не устроено, нет, да. Ой, родная, мягкая, ой, ты какая ты, да, понимаешь. Ладно, ой, наивная я что ли такая, да, понимаешь. Совсем что-то. Где-то, как ты так можешь сказать маме своей, да, я понял, конечно, что. Да. Ну ладно, они просто думают, да, вы просто вы уже, ребенок. Ну и мама тебя сиськой кормила, вроде то здесь все, да, то есть как бы, прикинь, мама, если когда не будет, да, то есть потом поймешь, да. Ну что, любом жить тебя грель, ну ты не замечаешь этого. Не в этом дело. Просто, да. Ну, наверное, какие-то проявления условий, условия труда какие-то, да. Да. Мужские функции на себя берет из-за этого. Да, вот и все, солнышко. Да, видишь, оказывается, интересно оказалось, да. Ну ладно, что теперь делать? Теперь перестанешь делать это. Да, вот отсюда дети и портятся, понимаешь, да? Вот это легче, да. Добро сделал. Добротин живем. Херни такие. Здравствуй, детство. Детство это хорошо, а ребенок плохо, да. Не знаю. Не знаю. Хорошо, ладно. Но мы не такие хорошие. Агрессивный. Все пусти. Что работа у меня не идет? Больной, я больной. Такой больной прям вообще. Да. Ну да, типа ничтожный. Я просто ничтожный.
Hey there, how's it going? I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. I just participated in the Mixing Game Jam 2020, which was hosted by the YouTube channel Mix It, and great videos diving into and recreating mechanics for popular games. You probably already know this, but if you don't, you should check them out. It's really good stuff. I took a short break from participating in game jams right before this, mostly because in the span of a month, I hosted with my own, and I participated in. So I kind of stop though. I've been making all sorts of other things, like working on a game live on Twitch, where every time we come to a major design decision, the chat gets to vote and we go with whatever they choose. I've done several more game dev challenges, as well as pulling an old project off the shelf. This is where the current YouTube trends say I should tell you to subscribe and hit the bell to potentially see future videos on said projects. Okay, so Mixing Game Jam ran from November 13th to the 15th. Participants had 48 hours to make a game with the theme of mixing genres. I personally think this is a really cool theme, and I was super excited to jump back into doing a game jam. Unfortunately, the jam date came at a pretty bad time. A few days earlier, my father and a person my wife interacts with at work tested positive for COVID. My wife, affectionately known on Twitch as Lady Lark, was tested, and if she tested positive, then both her and myself would do the same. So at the start of the jam, I'm a bit stressed out about my father's health, alongside with being in limbo about my own households. And unfortunately, the hardest part is that there is absolutely nothing I can do but sit and wait. So hopefully the jam can at least help keep my brain from eating itself. The theme announcement and beginning of the jam for my time zone was Friday at 10 a.m. But for months now, every Friday I do a stream on Twitch where I play viewers' games and give feedback, which I really don't like to skip. So I wasn't able to even begin thinking about the jam until much later that evening. I'm sure I started like mostly everyone else, checking a list of genres online. I've been wanting to figure out a multi-hit combo attack mechanic for a little while, so I started with the beat-em-up genre. It's something I've never done before, and it seemed like an interesting challenge. And since I was doing something completely new, I chose platformer as my second genre. It's definitely the genre that I'm the most comfortable with, and I have the most experience in. My first thought was to make a vertical scrolling climb the tower type game. Each floor would be a different room where you need to fight all the enemies to progress. That's definitely not much of a plan, but it's enough to start playing with the basic beat-em-up mechanics. At the beginning of a jam, I'm always trying to test out a quick idea to parse out if I'm able to actually make it within time or not. So it's time to get in and start working. With any platformer, I start with the player and the movement. And since movement is the biggest part of a platformer, I spend a good amount of time getting it to feel right to me. A variable jump height, coyote time, squash and stretch, particles. I basically remade the code that I built for another platform game that I made, and updated parts of it to make it work here. I've already done most of the hard work, so remaking it was pretty straightforward. Then I dug into making a combo system work. I'm thinking of a punch attack similar to the Dust Knuckle relic in Shovel Knight. So I have the single punch attack working, but I wanted the player to be able to combo hit in the air, which means the player should be able to jump up and attack multiple times before they hit the ground. And as I began working more and more with it, I realized I had no idea how to set this up. And that means I'm doing some research, which isn't great only every 8 hours. On top of that, when it rains, it pours. My wife unfortunately received a phone call that her great auntie only had a little bit of time left. Thankfully, this is not COVID related. She's 93, but it was still unexpected. But as we were self-isolating because we are in the midst of waiting for our own test, there was really nothing we could do but wait still. So back to the game to try and keep busy. At this point, my mind is racing, and I really just need to start doing something. But I can definitely tell that with where my head is at, I need to shrink the scope of this game by a lot. Learning something completely new just wasn't going to go well. I just didn't have the attention span to focus on it, and I'm pretty sure that it would just cause me way problems in the end. I have the platforming mechanics in already and keep that as my main genre. I've just got to figure out what to do now. While playing around from platform to platform, I thought I might have enemies coming in from the sides waves. So I basically just replaced the beat with shoot and kept moving forward. It was fairly simple. I just deleted the punch and replaced it with a bullet attack. To add a little something extra, I've always been a fan of screen wrapping, so if you fall off the bottom of the screen, reappear at the top. However, I am a bit concerned that if you just fall infinitely and just hold the shoot button down, you pretty much cover the entire screen in bullets. I could slow down the fire rate, but I like the faster fire rate because it feels a lot more like a shoot 'em up to me. So I'm not sure if the screen wrapping will stay. I'll have to see how it plays out in the future. I've only attempted to make one shmup style game in the past, and I did it as part of a 3-hour challenge. And unfortunately that one, I borked up the enemy spawning pretty good, so it's not quite really a good basis to move forward with. So I definitely can't use that, which means I don't have much to go on for setting up a wave system. My first thought was to just have continually moving spawners that I could trigger to create enemies wherever they were. Pretty quickly, I ran into the first issue of pairing a platformer with a bird. My first thought was to just have continually moving spawners that I could trigger to create an a wave system. My first thought was to just have continually moving spawners that I could trigger to create enemies wherever they were. Pretty quickly, I ran into the first issue of pairing a platformer with a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. In a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, the player can move to any elevation they need to, so they can always fire directly at whatever enemy is coming towards them. With a platformer, if you can't hit the enemy while standing directly on top of the platform, you have to jump, in which case it's a bit harder to hit the enemy continuously. My first thought was to make a big yellow box in the background that the player is protecting, and when all enemies spawn, they move themselves towards that box, funneling them so the player can shoot them more easily. My initial thought is that this could be a ship or something like that again, you're protecting. I pretty quickly realized that I'm not the biggest fan of this. It just clumps up the enemies, and doesn't look very good, and it doesn't play very well either. But at this point, it's pretty late, so it's time for me to go to bed, and I'll pick this back up tomorrow. So getting back to the game on Saturday, I decided I needed a new enemy type. I just have the one that flies across the screen, and I would really like one that fires at the player. This new enemy type will spawn off screen, and then fly to a set point that was determined when they respawn. The enemies will always track and fire at the player at set intervals. Now with the basic mechanics and 2 enemy types, it's time to start on art, because I can never really get a great sense for how the game is going to feel until I get the core art in. As always, I grabbed a color palette off Lowspec.com. This time I'm using the Endesca 32 palette by Nitro. When designing a player character, I try to keep a couple of things in mind. The most important to me being the silhouette and the animation. I want the player to be easy to read and to tell what they're doing. And because I work alone and I make all the art, I need to use a limited number of animation frames to save time. You may notice that in a lot of my games, the characters don't have arms. Mostly because the animating arms just adds more time and work to animating the character. For this jam, to save time, I've decided to not only not put arms on it as usual, but also to forego legs. I made this little tank-like robot with treads instead of feet. This should save a lot of animation time. I just need to make it cute. This also makes it reasonable of how the player can move back and forth while still shooting forward all the time. The time saving measures actually went so far that I added a little flag to the player, but realized that as it moved around, I would need it to flip back and forth, and that just added another thing that I had to make in Impact. So, to just save myself that little bit of extra time, I removed it and eventually replaced it with a small antenna that didn't have to change animations when I was moving backwards or forward. I know it may seem negligible, but with a limited amount of time, not to mention all the other stuff going on, every little bit of saving helps. Before making the animations, I threw the base character into the game just to see how it looked. I also made a cute little muzzle switch for when it fires, just to tie it all together. With the character looking cute, I then made more game art elements and did some testing to see if they all looked right before I started animation. Again, needing to keep the scope as small as possible, I made the platforms that the player can jump on, as well as a couple enemies and different bullets. One of the enemies, as you can see, was inspired by a bullet bill, and the other one, I honestly have no idea. Sometimes I just make things and I'm not sure why. I wanted an enemy that would shoot at the player, and I thought it would be kind of cool to signal that they were ones that shot by having flames kind of swirling around in their face all the time. Another trick to get more enemies for the price of what you've already done is to just recolor them. It worked in the Nintendo days and it still works today. I then made a third enemy that I really want to be the boss if I have time. Fingers crossed I'll be able to do something cool with it at least. With all the main art elements created, it's time to animate. I get asked in the comments quite a bit what art software I'm using, and I use two. Where you've seen me working so far, I've been designing in Photoshop. Now we're going to take everything over into a program called Sprite, and that's where I like to animate. Point of clarity, if you want to do pixel art, Photoshop is actually really bad at it. I've just been working in Photoshop for 20 plus years now, so it's the program I feel most comfortable with, but it is terrible for animating, so I jump over to Sprite for that. The animation this time was fairly simple by design, mostly just adding flame flickerings and a little bit more. And now one of the more time-consuming parts of the process, implementing all of the animations into the game and getting them set up. This process isn't very difficult, it's just time-consuming. Keeping with the efforts to make everything simple and quick, I made a starry parallaxing background. It's really easy to make and looks pretty good. The moving enemy spawners that I put in before just weren't working the way I wanted. They just caused too many issues with enemies spawning in positions where it was difficult to shoot. So I decided to change tactics here and create lanes the enemies could spawn in. When an enemy spawns, they can be at one of 5 heights. This way, they'll always be at the height that the player can hit them while standing on one of the platforms. I put each platform at a different elevation. That way the player has to gauge which one they need to jump on in order to easily shoot the enemies. By this point, I don't feel like I've gotten very far, and it's pretty late on Saturday night already. To make matters worse, the jam ends tomorrow, Sunday, at 10 a.m. So, time to go into overdrive mode. I slapped together a wave spawning system that's pretty dang. I basically hard-coded in the patterns. I would love to have made this a little bit more efficient and modular. In a jam, you just have to make it work. That's all. And I don't have time to remake it, so I'm going to go with it. I set up a counter to keep track of how many enemies are spawned, and then I subtract from that counter every time an enemy is destroyed. That way the game will know when each wave is over. I added a score counter to feel more like a spunk. When you kill an enemy, it increases by a fixed amount. I really...
Time to close this check. And start a new one. Guys, it's time for a new instrument, and I'm so proud to announce that I'm a Boston ambassador now, and we are going to pick a new Boston grand piano in Hamburg at the Boston Quality Center, and I'm going to take you with me. Let's go.
Никто не смотрит. Нет, да, что-то, причем здесь это? Не радуешься,
If you want to add bonuses and multipliers for things like killing the enemies quickly or possibly grabbing a pickup. But with the time left, I think that's going to happen. At least this is functioning. We're going to see a pattern here. I have 3 waves working right now. In each wave, the enemies get a little faster and spawn a little closer together. My plan was to just work through the night and get as much done as I can before the morning. But unfortunately, at around 2 a.m., we received the call that my wife's great aunt had sadly passed away. So obviously, I stopped working on the game, and I figured at that point, that was pretty much it. I'll try to get up in the morning and finish what I can, but right now, it's not the most important thing I have to do. My hope was to get up early, but I'm just not a morning person. Plus, with how late I went to bed, I wasn't able to drag myself back to work until about 8:30 in the morning. Keep in mind, the jam ends for my time at 10 a.m. With as rough as this weekend's been going, I was pleasantly surprised to see the 1-hour grace period been added to the deadline to allow for exporting and uploading. That's not a break you get very often, so it's time to get as much done as I can. I added the light indicator and the wave counter to the HUD. I forgot to mention it earlier, but I did end up removing the screen wrapping. It really just encouraged imminently falling and firing, and it wasn't very fun. So now, if you fall off the screen, you just take 1 point of damage and you respawn at the center platform. I quickly slapped together some of the most bare-bones menus I've ever made. Deciding on the name for the game was actually easier than usual. I've always used the term shmup for shoot 'em up. I'm pretty sure I've done it several times in this video. And jump shmup just sounded kind of clever and funny, so I went with it and didn't do about it. I added sound effects that I purchased from the Humble Bundle a while back. I made some quick art for the menu to explain how the controls work. At this point, I'm over a half an hour into my time, and the game is as done as I'm going to be able to make it. Anything else I want to do would just take far too long. I exported the game, I tested it once or twice, and I clicked the submit button with 6 minutes and 12 seconds left. After that, I took some time to make the art for the itch page, cover image, that kind of thing. Threw it up, and I went back to bed. Mentally, it had been a really long weekend, but I did it.
On vous a peut-être dit que pour avoir des clients et faire marcher son business, il fallait absolument avoir un blog, écrire des articles tous les jours.
So here's the game.
Okay, I finally arrived. The beautiful hotel room. But guess where I'm so done. Totally done. It's nearly 10 a.m. now. It's 10 a.m. now. It's 10 p.m. now, and I'm so tired. So I'll just brush my teeth and go to bed, and we'll see us tomorrow. Bye. Good morning. I'm about to go to Boston now and pick my new piano. I'm so excited, so let's go.
Привет! Добро пожаловать на канал Yandex. В прошлых выпусках муж...
Я, короче, не... Да, вот я понимаю. Я думаю, работать не не, но все равно как бы так вот оно и получается, ты пойми, да, то есть ты же, да, понимаешь, женщина вообще, да, это не по-рыцарски просто, не по-человечески, да. Понял себя уже, да. Не знаю, работать надо, да. Желательно так, конечно, да. Ну да, понимаю, да. Ладно, обида, что ли? Я тоже, я что, не обидишь, что ли? Ну, да, ну, ладно, это все дело. Теперь нормально. Ничтожно. Ничтожно.
with the movement and the presentation. The little tank is super cute and squishy, just how I like my player character. Jumping around and destroying
Почему? Вот
enemies.
от чего так получается? Смотри, моя версия такая, ну, понял, не разбери, как говорит, да. Ну, нет, меняют.
It's pretty fun, and I don't think that it's too challenging, which is why I like to make my game jam games. For a 48-hour game jam, I don't think this is too bad, especially with all the curveballs that life threw at me over this weekend. In the end, I was really excited to have been able to make something that I think is okay, and from the comments it appears that a lot of other people seem to enjoy it as well. I have discovered two major bugs which are pretty unfortunate. The biggest one is that sometimes the wave tracker miscounts, meaning that the next wave just won't spawn. This requires a reset to fix, which I'm really unhappy about. I'm sorry to anybody that played and had this happen. The other bug fix, which meaning that the next wave just won't spawn. This requires a reset to fix, which I'm really unhappy about. I'm sorry to anybody that played and had this happen. The other bug is I apparently didn't use DT properly in the jump, because if your monitor is set to 144 Hz, the jump does this. Setting the monitor to 60 Hz fixes it, but that's not meant to happen, of course, so yeah, that's a problem. If I had had more time, I would have loved to at least have added a boss fight, as well as adding a better scoring system. Right now, if you kill the enemies, you get a set amount of points, and that's pretty much it. It's a little boring. Power-ups would have also been great, but at this point I'm just starting to dream. It was 48 hours after all. I know, I can always go back and update the games, but with game jams, I usually just don't. For me, game jams are about the experience, and the game itself is a product of that experience. Updating it later changes it in some way for me. That's not to say that I never do it. I just don't think that this mechanic set is calling to me at the moment. Blending the shoot-'em-up and platformer genres was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed working out the different problems and how to make them work together. Overall, this was a crazy weekend and a super fun jam. I'm writing this a week later, and thankfully I can give some good updates. Lady Lark's test came back negative, and my father had some strong symptoms for a few days, but is doing much, much better. Thank you to everyone from the community that reached out with warm wishes during that time. I truly hope each and every one of you is safe and healthy wherever you are, and if you're not, I hope for a speedy recovery. If you would like to try this game, there's a link in the description, and while you're there, check out some of the other 675 entries. There's a lot of really cool games in there. Go check them out. Thank you all very much for watching. I'd like to give an extra special shout out to all of my wonderful patrons, especially Abby Sean, David Scott, Nightfall, Kevin Halgout, Liam Sorta, MLK, Modsmith, Nazar Lynn, Scott Hansen, Sophie No, and Straight Up Run. You're all awesome people, and in these crazy times, I truly appreciate the support. Again, if you would like to play this game or any of the others from the jam, the links are in the description. To get in contact with me, you can stop by my Twitch streams, message me on Twitter, or join the Discord with a lot of other really cool people. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will talk to you next time. Have a good one. Later.
Напрягаете, да? Ну нет, понимаешь, всегда. Ну вот я по себе говорю, наоборот, ну, а что, долго это делать, да? Вот смотри, чтобы, ну, ты понял, наоборот, да.
Last video, I laid out the structure of a neural network. I'll give a quick recap here, just so that it's fresh in our minds, and then I have two main goals for this video. The first is to introduce the idea of gradient descent, which underlies not only how neural networks learn, but how a lot of other machine learning works as well. Then after that, we're going to dig in a little more to how this particular network performs, and what those hidden layers of neurons end up actually looking for. As a reminder, our goal here is the classic example of handwritten digit recognition, the hello world of neural networks. These digits are rendered on a 28 by 28 pixel grid, each pixel with some grayscale value between 0 and 1. Those are what determine the activations of 784 neurons in the input layer of the network. And then the activation for each neuron in the following layers is based on a weighted sum of all the activations in the previous layer, plus some special number called a bias. Then you compose that sum with some other function, like the sigmoid squishification or ReLU, the way that I walked through last video. In total, given the somewhat arbitrary choice of 2 hidden layers here with 16 neurons each, the network has about 13,000 weights and biases that we can adjust. And it's these values that determine what exactly the network, actually does. Then what we mean when we say that this network classifies a given digit is that the brightest of those 10 neurons in the final layer corresponds to that digit. And remember, the motivation that we had in mind here for the layered structure was that maybe the second layer could pick up on the edges, and the third layer might pick up on patterns like loops and lines, And the last one could just piece together those patterns to recognize digits. So here, we learn how the network learns. What we want is an algorithm where you can show this network a whole bunch of training data, which comes in the form of a bunch of different images of handwritten digits, along with labels for what they're supposed to be, and it'll adjust those 13,000 weights and biases so as to improve its performance on the training data. Hopefully, this layered structure will mean that what it learns generalizes...
Ты понимаешь, то есть как бы... Ну, это, смотри, это преимущество, да, я тебя понял. Вот что тебе надо-то? Ты что, ты, когда он тебе про себя говорил-то? Наоборот. Нет, ну надо. Либо нет, нет, понял. Нет, да наоборот, вот это не говорит. Наоборот, нет. А вы за студией? Я легко сейчас. Ну нет, понял. Я же не умею рисовать-то, так что... Ну, шутил уже.
Beyond that training data. And the way we test that is that after you train the network, you show it more labeled data that it's never seen before. And you see how accurately it classifies those new images. Fortunately for us, and what makes this such a common example to start with, is that the good people behind the MNIST database have put together a collection of tens of thousands of handwritten digit images, each one labeled with the numbers that they're supposed to be. And as provocative as it is to describe a machine as learning, once you actually see how it works, it feels a lot less like some... Fortunately for us, and what makes this such a common example to start with, is that the good people behind the MNIST database, and what makes this such a common example to start with, is that the good people behind the MNIST database have put together a collection of tens of thousands of handwritten digit images, each one labeled with the numbers that they're supposed to be. And as provocative as it is to describe a machine as learning, once you actually see how it works, it feels a lot less like some crazy sci-fi premise, and a lot more like, well, a calculus exercise. I mean, basically it comes down to finding the minimum of a certain function. Remember, conceptually, we're thinking of each neuron as being connected to all of the neurons in the previous layer. The weights in the weighted sum defining its activation are kind of like the strength of those connections. And the bias is some indication of whether that neuron tends to be active or inactive. And to start things off, we're just going to initialize all of those weights and biases totally randomly. Needless to say, this network is going to perform pretty horribly on a given training example, since it's just doing something random. For example, you feed in this image of a 3, and the output layer, it just looks like a mess. So what you do is you define a cost function, a way of telling the computer, no, bad computer. That output should have activations which are 0 for most neurons, but 1 for this neuron. What you gave me is utter trash. To say that a little more mathematically, what you do is add up the squares of the differences between each of those trash output activations and the value that you want them to have. And this is what we'll call the cost of a single training example. Notice, this sum is small, the cost of a single training example. Notice, this sum is small when the network confidently classifies the image correctly, but it's large when the network seems like it doesn't really know what it's doing. So then what you do is it doesn't really know what it's doing. Notice, this sum is small when the network confidently classifies the image correctly, but it's large when the network seems like it doesn't really know what it's doing. So then what you do is consider the average thing. But it's large when the network seems like it doesn't really know what it's doing. So then what you do is consider the average cost over all of the tens of thousands of training examples at your disposal. this average cost is our measure for how lousy the network is and how bad the computer would feel. And that's a complicated thing. Remember how the network itself was basically a function, one that takes in 784 numbers as inputs, the pixel values, and spits out 10 numbers as its output. And in a sense, it's parameterized by all these weights and biases. Well, the cost function is a layer of complexity on top of that. It takes as its input those 13,000 or so weights and biases, and it spits out a single number describing how bad those weights and biases are. And the way it's defined depends on the network's behavior over all the tens of thousands of pieces of training data. That's a lot to think about. But just telling the computer what a crappy job it's doing isn't very helpful. You want to tell it how to change those weights and biases so that it gets better. To make it easier, rather than struggling to imagine a function with 13,000 inputs, just imagine a simple function that has one number as an input and one number as an output. How do you find an input that minimizes the value of this function? Calculus students will know that you can sometimes figure out that minimum explicitly, but that's not always feasible for really complicated functions. Certainly not in the 13,000 input version of this situation for our crazy complicated network function. A more flexible tactic is to start at any old input and figure out which direction you should step to make that output lower. Specifically, if you can figure out the slope of the function where you are, then shift to the left if that slope is positive, and shift the input to the right if that slope is negative. Positive, slope of the function where you are, then shift to the left if that slope is positive, and shift the input to the right if that slope is negative. If you do this repeatedly, at each point checking the new slope and taking the appropriate step, you're going to approach some local minimum of the function. And the image you might have in mind here is a ball rolling down a hill. And notice, even for this really simplified single input function, there are many possible valleys that you might land in, depending on which random input you start at. And there's no guarantee that the local minimum you land in is going to be the smallest possible value of the cost function. That's going to carry over to our neural network case as well. And I also want you to notice how, if you make your step sizes proportional to the slope, then when the slope is flattening out towards the minimum, your steps get smaller and smaller. And that kind of helps you from overshooting. Bumping up the complexity a bit, imagine instead a function with two inputs and one output. You might think of the input space as the xy plane, the cost function as being graphed as a surface above it. Now instead of asking about the slope of the function, you have to ask which direction should you step in this input space so as to decrease the output of the function most quickly. In other words, what's the downhill direction? And again, it's helpful to think of a ball rolling down that hill. Those of you familiar with multivariable calculus will know that the gradient of a function gives you the direction of steepest ascent. Basically, which direction should you step to increase the function most quickly? Naturally enough, taking the negative of that gradient gives you the direction to step that decreases the function most quickly. And even more than that, the length of this gradient vector is actually an indication for just how steep that steepest slope is. Now, if you're unfamiliar with multivariable calculus and you want to learn more, check out some work that I did for Khan Academy on the topic. Honestly,
Люди ко мне относятся, ты что опять жалобу свою начинаешь говорить, забыл? Нет, вот он, как я такой неадекватный, вообще, как я дожил до таких языков, кто-то неадекватный просто, да. Наверное, это вообще-то скайбер, да, может я так и говорила, да. Нет, подарок. Меня, знаешь, почему тоска? Какой-то вот, знаешь, типа того, чтобы, ну да, ну вот ты меня понял же, по-своему просто говорил, да. Потому что я мужик, блин, какой-то без яиц, да, типа, не без яиц уж просто так, да.
у меня вот нету, понимаешь, это. Да, ну я нет, да, вот большой. Его могли вырасти, война просто, да. Вот, да, ну нет, типа того. Как-то всех устраивало, что я такой слабый, да. Для мужчины быть слабым это нормально, понимаешь? Да. Все, я не люблю. Ну, может тебе мерещится, что ты слабый, все равно ты мужик, потому что это нормально. И наоборот. Ну если так уже сделано природой, ты уже обратно ничего не вернешь, да. Ты, вот когда я вот так это объясняю. Вот ты с утра женщина такая, она ложится спать. Ой, что-то надоело мне, только дай-ка это самое, она уже усы отрастила, все, завтра уже мужиком буду, а то что-то мужики хорошо живут, а что-то это самое. Опа, да, проснулась такая, опа, яйца наклюнулись там, наросли уже. Да, будем разговаривать с тобой, да. И как соответственно у тебя там и как бы сказать, все остальное тоже привезено, да. Ну потому что это семенники, там семя, понимаешь? Ты можешь остальное все как бы трубочка, а это вот самое главное, это дети. Семя это дети, а это просто трубочка детей, да, понимаешь, вот, да. Весь процесс вон там, да, вы не понимаете, да. Да когда представляешь, сколько химии вокруг нас, я понял уже, да. Вращается, то есть он вращается, да. Ну да, ладно, понял. Ну да. А, ну тогда не размножайся, давай, кайду надо записываться сразу. Я религию вернулся, да, понятно. Ну да, я вот про это и говорю, то есть все равно женщина мне нормально, по природе она не мужчина совсем, да, и если ты ей даже скажешь, вот как на духу, она так, допустим, представляешь, она такая пришла к Богу, а что-то ты меня родил неправильно, я такой, Бог такой, ну ладно, давай иди будь мужиком тогда, она такая, Бог такой, опа, не-не, я буду лучше уродской женщиной, да, к примеру, я не знаю, что вы верите, просто, да, то есть как бы, да. Ну да, ну так есть, да. Да, со своего ну да, ну это как бы да, отсутствие ума, да, ну да, да. То есть надо культивировать слабость, значит, женщина, понимаешь? Да, да. То есть отсутствие силы как-то это, да, мозг даже. Нет, так это же ты не понимаешь, что ли, мама? Ну, мама это вообще как бы ненормально, это нездорово, это как-то очень, да, вообще, вообще ужасно просто кошмар это, понимаешь? Это так холодно, так жестоко, жестко просто, да, нечеловечно просто, да. Прямо вот я понимаю просто, да. Вот я не знаю зачем, я тебе говорю, вот просто, да. Ну, бабека-то, в чем он орет там, вот, понимаешь? Никто не может, да, понимает. Кто знает, может так даже, да. Ладно, я так говорил просто, да. Нет, не надо меня, короче, не надо, короче. Не хороший, не плохой, там. Все нормально. Ну вас. Ладно, я сам даже умею все. Сам проехал.
All that matters for you and me right now is that in principle there exists a way to compute this vector. This vector that tells you what the downhill direction is and how steep it is. You'll be okay if that's all you know and you're not rock solid on the details.
Дурдомщик просто, дурдом просто. Я так и говорю. Ошибся тебе.
That tells you what the downhill direction is and how steep it is. You'll be okay if that's all you know and you're not rock solid on the details.